The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. As 17-year-old twins, Arya and Luna sat in the back row of the courtroom gallery. They watched their father, Attorney General David Carter, adjust his tie one last time before standing to deliver what everyone knew would be the most important speech of his career. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled half the seats, their cameras ready to catch every word. Civil rights leaders sat alongside government officials, all waiting to hear how this case would end. But for Arya and Luna, this wasn't just another case. This was their dad fighting for something he'd believed in his whole life. David Carter had come a long way from the small apartment in Detroit where he grew up. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, and his father had been laid off from the auto plant when David was just 12. Back then, the idea of becoming a lawyer seemed impossible. College was expensive and law school was something rich kids did. But David's mother had a saying that stuck with him through everything. "The law isn't just for rich folks," she'd tell him while she ironed other people's clothes to make extra money. "Someday someone like us needs to be in that courtroom making sure everyone gets treated fair." That someday had finally come. The case before the court today involved a school district that had been quietly pushing Black and Hispanic students toward vocational programs while steering white students toward college prep classes. It had taken 3 years of investigation to prove what parents in the community had suspected all along. Their kids were just as smart, just as capable, but they weren't getting the same chances. David stood up slowly, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. He looked around the courtroom, his eyes briefly meeting those of his daughters. Arya gave him a small smile while Luna sat forward in her seat, completely focused on every word he was about to say. "Your Honor," David began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "We're not here today because someone broke a window or stole a car. We're here because an entire generation of children had their futures stolen from them, one guidance counselor meeting at a time." The twins had heard their father practice this speech at home for weeks. They'd watched him pace around the kitchen table, testing different words, different ways to explain why this case mattered so much. But hearing it now, in this moment, with all these important people listening, felt completely different. "These children didn't ask to be born into families that spoke Spanish at home," David continued. "They didn't choose their skin color or their zip code. But they deserved the same shot at calculus class, the same encouragement to take the SATs, the same belief from their teachers that they could succeed." One of the reporters in the front row was typing furiously on her laptop. Arya wondered what people watching the news tonight would think about her dad's words. Would they understand why this mattered? Would they care about kids they'd never met, in schools they'd never seen? David had always been careful to explain to his daughters how lucky they were. They went to Preston Academy, one of the best private schools in the country. Their teachers expected them to go to Harvard or Yale. No one ever suggested they might be better suited for cosmetology school or auto repair. "But Dad," Luna had asked one night after hearing about the case, "why don't all kids get to go to schools like ours?" David had been quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because the world isn't fair yet, sweetheart. That's why we have to keep fighting to make it better." Now, watching him in court, both girls understood what that fight looked like. Their father wasn't just giving a speech. He was carrying the hopes of hundreds of families who trusted him to speak for them when they couldn't speak for themselves. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming," David said, gesturing toward a stack of documents on his table. "We have emails from administrators discussing how to manage expectations for certain students. We have data showing that students with identical test scores were given completely different academic paths, based solely on their last names and their addresses." The defense lawyer, a well-dressed woman with silver hair, took notes but didn't look surprised. She'd been doing this long enough to know when a case was slipping away from her. David pulled out a folder and opened it carefully. "Let me tell you about Rodriguez. She's 16 now, working at a fast food restaurant to help her family pay rent. 3 years ago, her math teacher recommended her for advanced algebra, but when she went to sign up, the guidance counselor looked at her file and said there must have been some mistake. Students from her neighborhood, he explained, usually did better in the practical math class." Arya felt her stomach tighten. She knew girls like Rodriguez from the community center where she and Luna volunteered on weekends. Smart girls, funny girls, girls who dreamed about becoming doctors and engineers and teachers, but somehow, The world kept telling them to dream smaller. Rodriguez never got the chance to take advanced algebra, David continued. Without it, she couldn't take calculus. Without calculus, she couldn't take the AP classes she needed for college. One decision by one counselor changed the entire direction of her life. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the reporters had stopped typing, caught up in the story David was telling. "This case isn't about one school or one district," David said, his voice growing stronger. "This is about whether we really believe that all children deserve the same opportunities, or whether we're content to keep sorting them into different futures based on things they can't control." Luna reached over and squeezed her sister's hand. They both knew their father was about to wrap up his argument, and they could feel the weight of history in the room. "Your Honor, the Constitution promises equal protection under the law. But equal protection means nothing if we allow schools to build invisible walls around our children's dreams. Today we have the chance to tear down those walls. We have the chance to tell every child in America that their future is limited only by their effort and their imagination, not by their zip code or the color of their skin." David sat down, and for a moment the courtroom remained completely silent. Then the judge nodded slowly and announced that the court would recess for lunch before hearing closing arguments from the defense. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Arya and Luna made their way to their father. He was putting papers back into his briefcase, but when he saw them coming, his serious courtroom expression melted into the warm smile they knew so well. "How'd we do, girls?" he asked, though he could see the answer in their faces. "Dad, that was incredible," Arya said. "I got goosebumps when you talked about Rodriguez." "I just hope the judge was listening as carefully as you were," David replied, closing his briefcase. "Want to grab some lunch before the afternoon session?" As they walked out of the courthouse together, none of them could have imagined that in just a few hours, they would find themselves on the other side of the justice system, desperately hoping that someone would listen to their story with the same attention and care that David had just shown to Rodriguez and all the other students whose futures hung in the balance. The afternoon session had gone well. The defense lawyer had tried her best, but everyone in the courtroom could tell that the evidence was too strong to ignore. As they left the courthouse around 4 o'clock, David Carter felt cautiously optimistic. The judge would announce her decision in the morning, but he had a good feeling about how things had gone. "Dad, we need to get going," Luna said, checking her phone. "The charity auction starts at 6 and we still need to change clothes." The twins had promised to help with a fundraiser at Preston Academy. It was one of those fancy events where parents bid on vacation packages and art pieces to raise money for the school's scholarship fund. Arya and Luna were supposed to help check people in and hand out programs. "You sure you don't need me to drive you?" David asked as they reached the parking garage. "I could skip my meeting with the senator." "Dad, we've been driving for 6 months without crashing into anything," Arya laughed. "I think we can handle getting to school and back." David handed over the keys to his personal car, a sleek blue sedan that he'd bought himself as a gift when he became Attorney General. It was nothing too flashy, but nice enough that he felt good driving it to work each day. "Text me when you get there and when you're heading home," he said, giving each girl a quick hug. "And remember, if anything weird happens, call you immediately," the twins said in unison, rolling their eyes at their father's familiar worry. "I'm serious," David said. "Anything at all that doesn't feel right, you call me. Doesn't matter what meeting I'm in or who I'm talking to." The girls drove through downtown DC traffic, taking their time and being extra careful. They'd only had their licenses for 6 months, and driving in the city still made them nervous. The charity auction was in full swing when they arrived at Preston Academy, with well-dressed parents sipping wine and examining the items up for bid. "Thank goodness you're here," said Mrs. Patterson, the school's event coordinator. "We're running behind on everything. Could you girls handle the silent auction tables in the East Wing? Just make sure people are signing their names clearly on the bid sheets." For the next 2 hours, Arya and Luna walked around Pine Dot, his school's elegant hallways, helping parents navigate the auction items. There were signed sports memorabilia, artwork from local artists, and vacation packages to places like Italy and Japan. The twins had attended events like this their whole lives, but tonight felt different somehow. Maybe it was because they'd spent the day watching their father fight for kids who would never get to attend a school like Preston Academy. "Look at this," Arya whispered to her sister. pointing to a bid sheet for a weekend at a luxury spa resort. Someone just bid $8,000 for 2 days at a hotel. That's more than a lot of families make in 3 months, Luna replied quietly. Kind of puts things in perspective, doesn't it? By 8:30, the auction was winding down and the girls were getting ready to leave. They'd texted their father to let him know they were heading home, and he'd responded with his usual reminder to drive carefully and call if they needed anything. The route home took them through Riverside Heights, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the D.C. area. The houses were enormous, with perfectly manicured lawns and circular driveways. Street lamps cast a warm glow over the tree-lined streets and everything felt peaceful and safe. They were stopped at a red light on Maple Avenue when they heard the screech of tires behind them. Luna, who was driving, glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a black SUV swerving erratically as it approached the intersection. "That guy's driving like he's drunk," she said, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The light turned green, but before Luna could move forward, the SUV blew through the red light at full speed. Both girls watched in horror as it slammed into an elderly woman who was crossing the street in the crosswalk. The impact was terrible. The woman flew several feet before hitting the pavement hard. The SUV didn't even slow down, disappearing around the corner as if nothing had happened. For a split second, both girls sat frozen in shock. Then their training kicked in. Their father had always taught them that when something bad happens, you don't just drive away. You help. Luna pulled over immediately and put the car in park. Arya was already on her phone, dialing 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator answered. There's been a hit-and-run accident at the corner of Maple Avenue and 3rd Street, Arya said, her voice shaking but clear. An elderly woman has been hit by a car. We need an ambulance right away. Are you injured, ma'am? No, we're witnesses. We saw the whole thing. The car that hit her was a black SUV and it drove away. While Arya talked to the 911 operator, Luna ran to the injured woman. She was conscious but clearly in pain, with blood on her forehead and her left leg twisted at an odd angle. Don't try to move, Luna said gently, kneeling beside her. Help is coming. My purse, the woman whispered. Did they take my purse? No, ma'am, your purse is right here, Luna said, spotting it a few feet away. This wasn't a robbery. A car hit you, but we saw everything. The police are going to catch whoever did this. The woman's name was Elena Rodriguez, and she was 73 years old. She'd been walking home from evening mass at the church 2 blocks away. The same walk she'd taken twice a week for the past 15 years. She lived alone since her husband died, but her daughter checked on her every day. Arya finished talking to the 911 operator and joined her sister beside Mrs. Rodriguez. The ambulance is on the way, she said. And the police are coming too. Thank you, girls, Mrs. Rodriguez said weakly. You're good kids for stopping to help. The first police car arrived about 4 minutes later, followed quickly by an ambulance. Arya and Luna stepped back to give the paramedics room to work, but they stayed close by in case the police needed to ask them questions. That's when everything went wrong. The police officer who approached them was young, maybe late 20s, with short brown hair and suspicious eyes. His nameplate read Officer Johnson, and from the moment he looked at the twins, it was clear he'd already made up his mind about what had happened. You girls in the blue sedan? He asked, though it wasn't really a question. Yes, sir, Luna replied. We called 911. We saw the whole thing. Officer Johnson looked from the girls to their father's expensive car, then back to the girls. 2 well-dressed black teenagers in a luxury vehicle at the scene of a hit-and-run. In his mind, the math was simple. I need you both to put your hands where I can see them and step away from the vehicle, he said, his hand moving to rest on his gun. Arya felt her stomach drop. Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're the ones who called for help. We saw the car that hit Mrs. Rodriguez. I need you to turn around and put your hands on the car, Officer Johnson said, ignoring her explanation completely. A second police car had arrived, and Officer Williams, a black woman in her 40s, approached the scene. She took one look at what was happening and frowned. Johnson, what are you doing? She asked. Got our hit-and-run suspects right here, Johnson replied. Fancy car, nervous teenagers probably thought they could just call it in and play innocent. Did you run the plates? Officer Williams asked. Don't need to. It's obvious what happened here. Arya and Luna looked at each other in growing panic. This couldn't be happening. They'd done everything right. They'd stopped to help, called 911, stayed at the scene to give statements. How had they gone from good Samaritans to suspects? "Officer, please," Luna said, trying to keep her voice calm. "If you just listen to the 911 call, you'll hear my sister reporting the accident as it happened. We described the car that hit Mrs. Rodriguez. It was a black SUV, not our car. But Officer Johnson wasn't listening. He was already reaching for his handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent," he began, and Arya felt the world spinning around her. This was supposed to be the day their father won a major victory for civil rights. Instead, it was turning into their worst nightmare. As the handcuffs clicked into place, both girls thought the same thing. Dad always said to call him if anything weird happened. This definitely qualified as weird. But with their hands cuffed behind their backs and Officer Johnson already talking about vehicular assault charges, calling their father suddenly seemed a lot more complicated than it had that morning, when they were just two teenagers proud of their dad's work in the courthouse. The ambulance pulled away with Mrs. Rodriguez, and more police cars were arriving at the scene. Arya and Luna found themselves sitting in the back of a police car, watching officers examine their father's sedan for damage that they knew they wouldn't find. "Luna," Arya whispered, "what are we going to do?" "I don't know," her sister whispered back. "But Dad's going to find out about this soon enough. Let's just hope he can figure out how to fix it." Neither girl could have imagined that their father's position as Attorney General, which had always been a source of pride and protection, was about to become the very thing that made their situation infinitely more complicated. David Carter was in the middle of explaining police reform legislation to Senator Martinez when his phone buzzed. He glanced at it briefly, saw it was from an unknown number, and let it go to voicemail. Senators didn't like being interrupted during important meetings, and this conversation could affect funding for civil rights investigations across the country. 5 minutes later, his phone buzzed again. Same unknown number, then again. "Senator, I apologize, but I need to take this," David said, stepping into the hallway. "Dad?" It was Arya's voice, but she sounded different, scared. "Arya, whose phone are you using?" "Where are you?" "Dad, we're at the police station. Something terrible happened and they arrested us, but we didn't do anything wrong. We were trying to help someone, and now they're saying we hit her with the car, but we didn't. We called 911. We were the ones who called for help." David felt the floor seem to shift beneath his feet. "Slow down, sweetheart. What police station? Are you hurt?" "We're okay, but Dad, they won't listen to us. The officer who arrested us, he just looked at us and decided we were guilty. We tried to explain what really happened, but he wouldn't even look at the evidence." "Put one of the officers on the phone," David said, already walking toward the elevator. "They said we get one phone call and that's it." "Dad, what do we do?" David closed his eyes for a moment, his mind racing through options. As Attorney General, he oversaw federal law enforcement, but this sounded like a local matter. He couldn't just call up a local police chief and demand his daughters be released. That would look like corruption, and it would destroy everything he'd worked for. But these were his children. "Listen to me very carefully," he told Arya. "Don't say anything else to anyone until I get there with a lawyer. Nothing at all, do you understand? Even if they try to be friendly or say they just want to hear your side of the story." "Okay, Dad. But Luna's really scared, and they're talking about charges that could send us to prison for years." Prison. The word hit David like a punch to the stomach. His 17-year-old daughters, who'd never gotten so much as a speeding ticket, were facing serious criminal charges. "I'm on my way," he said. 20 minutes, maybe less. Just hold on." The ride to the police station was the longest 20 minutes of David Carter's life. He called Patricia Wong, one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the city, and asked her to meet him there immediately. He also called his chief of staff to cancel all his evening appointments. "Should I call the media office?" his chief of staff asked. "If this gets out before we can control the narrative, no media office," David said firmly. "My daughters are private citizens. They don't deserve to have their lives turned into a political football because of my job." But even as he said it, David knew that was wishful thinking. The Attorney General's children getting arrested would be front-page news by morning. No matter what he did, the Riverside Heights police station was a modern building that looked more like a bank than a place where criminals were processed. David had been there before for community meetings, back when he was just a prosecutor working his way up through the system. He'd never imagined he'd be walking through those doors as the parent of suspects. Officer Williams met him at the front desk. She looked uncomfortable, which David took as a good sign. "Mr. Attorney General," she said formally, "I want you to know that I've reviewed the 911 call your daughters made, and I have some concerns about how this case is being handled." "Where are my daughters?" David asked. "They're in holding cell number 3. They haven't been processed yet because we're waiting for the detective to finish his investigation." "What detective?" "This should be a simple matter of checking the evidence." Officer Williams glanced around nervously. "Detective Harrison is handling the case. He's not particularly interested in the 911 recording or the witness statements that contradict Officer Johnson's arrest report." David felt his anger building, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting emotional wouldn't help his daughters. Patricia Wong arrived 10 minutes later, carrying a briefcase and wearing the no-nonsense expression that made her one of the most feared defense attorneys in the city. She was a small woman with graying hair, but prosecutors had learned not to underestimate her. "David, I came as soon as I got your call," she said. "What exactly are we dealing with here?" Before David could answer, Detective Harrison approached them. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a thin mustache and the kind of swagger that suggested he thought he was more important than he actually was. "Attorney General Carter," Harrison said, extending his hand. "Wish we were meeting under better circumstances." David didn't shake the offered hand. "Detective, I'd like to see my daughters immediately." "Well, now that's a bit complicated," Harrison said. "See, your girls are suspects in a serious felony, hit and run, vehicular assault, leaving the scene of an accident. The victim is in the hospital with a broken leg and possible internal injuries. My clients called 911 to report the accident." Patricia Wong interrupted. "They stayed at the scene to help the victim." "That's hardly the behavior of guilty parties," Harrison shrugged. "A lot of criminals call 911 to throw off suspicion. Makes them look innocent. Of course, we know better." "Have you listened to the 911 recording?" David asked. "Don't need to. Got 2 suspects with an expensive car at the scene of a hit and run. Pretty open and shut if you ask me." Patricia Wong pulled out her phone and started taking notes. "Detective, are you saying you're not planning to investigate this case? You're not going to check for surveillance cameras, examine the vehicle for damage, or interview other witnesses?" "The car's being processed now," Harrison said. "As for witnesses, well, these things happen pretty fast. People don't always see what they think they saw." David realized what was happening, and it made him sick to his stomach. Detective Harrison had decided his daughters were guilty based on nothing more than their appearance and the fact that they were driving a nice car. The actual evidence didn't matter to him. "I want to see my daughters now," David said, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "Now hold on," Harrison said. "I know you're used to getting your way, but this is a local matter. You don't have any special privileges here." "Actually, Detective, he has the same privileges as any other parent," Patricia Wong said coolly. "And I have the right to speak with my clients immediately." Harrison looked like he wanted to argue, but he couldn't. 20 minutes later, David and Patricia were sitting in a small conference room with Arya and Luna. Both girls looked exhausted and scared, but they weren't hurt. "Dad, they won't listen to anything we say," Luna said, hugging her father tightly. "We tried to explain what happened, but Detective Harrison just kept saying we were lying." "Tell me exactly what happened," Patricia said, pulling out a legal pad. "Every detail you can remember." For the next hour, the twins told their story. They described the charity auction, the drive through Riverside Heights, the moment they saw the black SUV hit Mrs. Rodriguez. They explained how they'd called 911 immediately, how they'd stayed to help the victim, how they'd been completely cooperative with the first officers on the scene. "The 911 call should prove everything," Arya said. I described the accident as it was happening. I told them about the black SUV driving away. Patricia Wong had been taking notes throughout their story. When they finished, she looked up with a grim expression. "This is a good case for us," she said. "The evidence clearly supports your innocence. But I need to warn you about something. Detective Harrison isn't interested in evidence. He's already decided you're guilty, and he's going to try to build a case around that assumption. But that's not how the system is supposed to work," Luna said. David felt his heart break a little. His daughters had grown up believing in justice, believing that truth mattered more than prejudice. Now they were learning that the system didn't always work the way it was supposed to. "No, sweetheart, it's not," he said quietly. "But sometimes the system fails people. That's why we have defense attorneys and appeals courts." "Mr. Carter," Patricia said carefully. "There's something else we need to discuss. Your position as Attorney General is going to complicate this case enormously. The media attention alone could turn this into a circus." David nodded. He'd been thinking about that since he got the phone call. Every decision he made from this point forward would be scrutinized. If he used his influence to help his daughters, he'd be accused of corruption. If he didn't, his political enemies would say he cared more about his career than his family. "What do you recommend?" he asked. "We handle this like any other case," Patricia said. "We prove your daughter's innocence with evidence and facts. We don't ask for any special treatment, and we don't let anyone intimidate us into accepting a plea deal for something they didn't do." "How long will that take?" Arya asked. "Could be months," Patricia admitted. "Maybe longer if they try to take it to trial." David looked at his daughters, 17 years old and facing adult felony charges for trying to help an accident victim. This morning he'd stood in federal court fighting for equal justice under the law. Tonight, he was learning just how unequal that justice could be when the system decided you were guilty before it looked at the facts. "We fight," he said finally. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes. We prove your innocence," but even as he said the words, David Carter wondered if the system he'd devoted his life to serving was strong enough to overcome the prejudice and corruption that had put his daughters in this position. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure he believed in the system more than the system believed in him. The test was just beginning. 3 months later, the case had become exactly what David Carter had feared most, a media circus. Every morning, news vans lined up outside the courthouse. Every evening, talking heads on cable news debated whether the Attorney General's daughters were getting special treatment or being unfairly targeted because of their father's position. The twins had been released on bail the night of their arrest, but only after spending 6 hours in a holding cell. Detective Harrison had fought the bail request, claiming they were flight risks because their father had government connections. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the same connections Harrison claimed made them dangerous were the reason they'd never flee. Running away would destroy their father's career and everything he'd worked for. Patricia Wong had spent those 3 months building an airtight defense. She'd obtained surveillance footage from 3 different businesses that clearly showed the black SUV running the red light. She'd interviewed Mrs. Rodriguez, who confirmed that Arya and Luna were the ones who'd helped her after the accident. She'd analyzed the 911 call with audio experts who could prove Arya was describing the accident in real time, not recounting something that had already happened. But District Attorney Kenneth Blake wasn't backing down. Blake was up for re-election in 8 months, and prosecuting the Attorney General's daughters was the kind of high-profile case that could make his career. He'd held press conferences calling for equal justice regardless of family connections and promising that no one is above the law. The real breakthrough came when Patricia Wong discovered something Detective Harrison had tried to hide. Officer Johnson, the cop who'd arrested the twins, had a history of racially biased arrests. Over the past 3 years, he'd arrested 17 black teenagers for crimes that white teenagers had committed in the same area. In every case, the real perpetrators were caught later. But Johnson was never disciplined. Even more damaging, Internal Affairs had opened an investigation into Johnson's arrest patterns just 2 weeks before he arrested Arya and Luna. Detective Harrison had known about the investigation but never mentioned it in his reports. "Your Honor," Patricia Wong said during a pre-trial hearing, "Officer Johnson has a documented pattern of racially motivated arrests. The department knew about this pattern, yet they allowed him to continue making arrests based on nothing more than his personal biases." District Attorney Blake jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Officer Johnson's other cases have no bearing on this one." Judge Patricia Chen, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been on the bench for 20 years, looked unimpressed. "Mr. Blake, if Officer Johnson has a pattern of arresting black teenagers for crimes they didn't commit, that seems highly relevant to a case where he arrested 2 black teenagers for a crime they claim they didn't commit. We'll allow the evidence," Judge Chen ruled. That was the moment David Carter realized they might actually win this case. But victory felt hollow when he thought about all the other families who'd faced Officer Johnson's bias without the resources to fight back. The trial began on a gray Monday morning in late October. The courthouse was packed with reporters, civil rights activists, and curious members of the public. David sat in the front row behind the defense table, watching his daughters try to look confident despite the weight of the charges against them. District Attorney Blake's opening statement was exactly what Patricia Wong had expected. He painted the twins as privileged teenagers who thought they could get away with anything because of their father's position. He claimed they'd hit Mrs. Rodriguez while texting and driving, then called 911 to cover their tracks. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Blake said, gesturing toward Aria and Luna, "these defendants want you to believe they're heroes. They want you to believe they stopped to help an elderly woman out of the goodness of their hearts. But the evidence will show that they hit that woman with their car, panicked, and then tried to manipulate the system to avoid responsibility." It was a compelling story. If you ignored all the facts, Patricia Wong's opening statement was simpler and more direct. "The evidence in this case will show that Aria and Luna Carter did exactly what we'd want our own children to do in the same situation. They witnessed a terrible accident, immediately called for help, and stayed at the scene to assist the victim. They are not criminals. They are good Samaritans who had the misfortune of being black teenagers driving a nice car when a biased police officer decided to ignore the evidence and make assumptions based on prejudice. The prosecution's case fell apart almost immediately. Blake called Officer Johnson as his first witness, but Patricia Wong's cross-examination was devastating. "Officer Johnson, in the past 3 years, how many black teenagers have you arrested for crimes that white teenagers actually committed?" she asked. "I object to the characterization of that question," Blake interrupted. "Sustained," Judge Chen said. "Rephrase, counselor." "Officer Johnson, how many times in the past 3 years have you arrested a black teenager who was later found to be innocent of the charges?" Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't keep track of numbers like that. Would it surprise you to learn that Internal Affairs has documented 17 such cases? I wouldn't know about that." Patricia Wong walked to her table and picked up a thick folder. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Defense Exhibit A, the Internal Affairs investigation into Officer Johnson's arrest patterns." For the next hour, Patricia Wong methodically walked through Johnson's history of biased arrests. Each case followed the same pattern: a crime involving a black teenager and a white teenager, with Johnson always arresting the black teenager regardless of evidence. "Officer Johnson," Patricia Wong said finally, "when you arrived at the scene on Maple Avenue, did you ask to hear the 911 recording before making your arrest?" "No." "Did you check the defendant's car for damage consistent with a hit-and-run accident?" "That was done later." "Did you interview any other witnesses?" "There weren't any other witnesses." "Did you look for surveillance cameras that might have recorded the accident?" "That wasn't my job." "So you made arrests without checking the 911 recording, without examining the car, without looking for witnesses, and without checking for surveillance footage. What did you base your arrests on?" Johnson was quiet for a long moment. "The defendants were at the scene with a vehicle that could have been involved." "Officer Johnson, isn't it true that you arrested these teenagers based solely on the fact that they were black and driving an expensive car?" "Objection," Blake shouted. "I'll rephrase," Patricia Wong said calmly. "Officer Johnson, can you point to a single piece of evidence that suggested these teenagers were guilty of any crime?" Another long pause. "They were at the scene. So was the fire hydrant, Officer Johnson." "Did you arrest that too?" The courtroom erupted in nervous laughter, and Judge Chen had to call for order. Blake tried to salvage his case by calling Detective Harrison, but that went even worse. Patricia Wong introduced evidence that Harrison had refused to investigate leads that might have exonerated the twins. He'd ignored the 911 recording, dismissed the surveillance footage, and even refused to interview Mrs. Rodriguez when she tried to tell him that Aria and Luna had helped her. The most damaging moment came when Patricia Wong played the 911 recording in court. Aria's voice was clear and calm as she reported the accident in real time. 911, what's your emergency? There's been a hit-and-run accident at the corner of Maple Avenue and 3rd Street. An elderly woman has been hit by a car. We need an ambulance right away. Are you injured, ma'am? No, we're witnesses. We saw the whole thing. The car that hit her was a black SUV, and it drove away. The recording continued for several minutes with Aria providing a detailed description of the SUV and its license plate number. It was impossible to listen to that recording and believe she was describing an accident she'd caused herself. Blake's case collapsed completely when Patricia Wong called Mrs. Rodriguez as a witness. The elderly woman walked slowly to the witness stand, still using a cane from her injuries, but her voice was strong and clear. "Those girls saved my life," she testified. "When I was lying on that street scared and hurt, they were the ones who came to help me. They stayed with me until the ambulance came. They held my hand and told me everything would be okay." "Mrs. Rodriguez," Patricia Wong asked gently, "did you see the vehicle that hit you?" "Yes, it was a big black truck. It came out of nowhere and hit me, then just drove away like I was nothing." "Was it the same car that Aria and Luna were driving?" "Oh no, absolutely not. Their car was blue and much smaller. The truck that hit me was huge and black." Blake tried to suggest that Mrs. Rodriguez might be confused because of her injuries, but she wasn't having any of it. "Young man," she said firmly, "I may be 73 years old, but I know the difference between the car that nearly killed me and the car belonging to the angels who saved me." On the final day of testimony, Patricia Wong called her surprise witness Thomas Mitchell, a wealthy businessman who'd been arrested for drunk driving the same night as the twins. Mitchell had been driving a black SUV and had hit a parked car 6 blocks from where Mrs. Rodriguez was injured. He'd been released on his own recognizance and charged with a misdemeanor. "Mr. Mitchell," Patricia Wong asked, "where were you driving on the night of August 15th? "I was in the Riverside Heights area," Mitchell admitted. "I'd been at a business dinner and had too much to drink." "Did you hit anything that night?" Mitchell's lawyer whispered something in his ear, then nodded. "I hit a parked car on Oak Street." "Mr. Mitchell, is it possible you also hit a pedestrian that night and don't remember because you were intoxicated?" "Objection," Blake shouted, but the damage was done. The jury took less than 2 hours to return a verdict of not guilty on all charges. When the foreperson read the verdict aloud, Aria and Luna collapsed into each other's arms, finally allowing themselves to cry after months of holding it together. David Carter felt a mix of relief and anger as he watched his daughters celebrate their freedom. They'd won, but only after months of stress and uncertainty that never should have happened in the first place. The system had failed them at every level, from Officer Johnson's biased arrest to Detective Harrison's refusal to investigate, to District Attorney Blake's decision to prosecute a case with no evidence. As they left the courthouse, David put his arms around his daughters and thought about all the families who'd faced similar injustices without the resources to fight back. The system had worked for Aria and Luna, but only because they'd been able to afford the best lawyer in the city, and only because their father's position had guaranteed media attention. "Dad," Luna said as they walked to their car, "what happens to all the kids who don't have someone like Patricia Wong to defend them?" It was exactly the question David had been asking himself for months, and he still didn't have a good answer. 6 months after the trial ended, Judge Patricia Chen was preparing for what would be the most important sentencing hearing of her career. Not because of the defendants sitting before her, but because of what this case had revealed about the entire justice system. The courtroom was packed again, but this time it wasn't Aria and Luna sitting at the defendants' table. They were in the gallery with their father, watching as Officer Johnson and Detective Harrison faced federal charges for civil rights violations and conspiracy to deny equal protection under the law. The federal investigation that followed the Winte twins' acquittal had uncovered a pattern of corruption that went far beyond racial bias. Internal emails showed that Detective Harrison had been pressuring officers to make arrests in high-profile neighborhoods to justify increased police presence. Officer Johnson wasn't just targeting black teenagers randomly. He was following orders to create statistics that would support requests for more funding. The investigation had also revealed that District Attorney Blake knew the case against Aria and Luna was weak from the beginning. He'd prosecuted them anyway because he thought winning a case against the Attorney General's daughters would boost his re-election chances. Blake had resigned in disgrace 2 months earlier when evidence of his misconduct became public. But today wasn't about Johnson, Harrison, or Blake. Today was about Thomas Mitchell, the businessman who'd actually hit Mrs. Rodriguez with his SUV that night. After months of investigation, prosecutors had finally built a case against him for hit and run, driving under the influence and leaving the scene of an accident. Mitchell sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit, flanked by 3 high-priced lawyers. He'd initially denied any involvement in Mrs. Rodriguez's injuries, But surveillance footage from a gas station 2 blocks away had captured his license plate just minutes after the accident. Paint samples from Mrs. Rodriguez's clothing matched his SUV perfectly. Throughout the investigation and trial, Mitchell had shown no remorse. His lawyers had argued that he was too drunk to remember hitting anyone, as if that somehow made it better. They'd tried to claim that Mrs. Rodriguez had been jaywalking, even though she'd been in a clearly marked crosswalk. They'd even suggested that her injuries weren't that serious, despite the fact that she'd spent 2 weeks in the hospital and would never walk without pain again. Judge Chen had listened to months of legal maneuvering with growing frustration. She'd watched Mitchell's lawyers try every trick in the book to minimize his responsibility, while the real heroes of this story sat quietly in the gallery, still dealing with the trauma of having been arrested for trying to help. Now it was time for sentencing, and Judge Chen had been thinking about this moment for weeks. The maximum sentence for Mitchell's crimes was 15 years in prison. The minimum was probation and community service. The prosecution was recommending 8 years. The defense was asking for time served and rehab. Mrs. Rodriguez had asked to speak at the sentencing hearing, and Judge Chen had agreed. The elderly woman walked slowly to the podium, still using her cane 6 months after the accident. When she reached the microphone, she turned to look directly at Mitchell before beginning to speak. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice steady and clear, "you nearly killed me that night. But that's not what I'm angry about. Accidents happen, and I know you didn't mean to hurt me." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat but didn't look up. "What I'm angry about," Mrs. Rodriguez continued, "is what you did after you hit me. You left me lying in that street like I was garbage. You drove away and went home to your comfortable house while I lay bleeding on the pavement, wondering if I was going to die." The courtroom was completely silent. And then, when 2 good girls stopped to help me, when they called for an ambulance and held my hand and told me everything would be okay, your cowardice put them in jail. They saved my life, and they were arrested for it while you slept peacefully in your own bed. Mrs. Rodriguez paused, wiping tears from her eyes. "I forgive you for hitting me, Mr. Mitchell, but I will never forgive you for what your selfishness did to those girls. They're the heroes in this story. You're just the man who was too much of a coward to face the consequences of his actions." She turned and walked back to her seat, and Judge Chen felt the weight of the moment settling over the courtroom. When it was time for sentencing, Judge Chen stood slowly and looked around the packed courtroom. She saw Arya and Luna sitting with their father, still processing the trauma of what they'd been through. She saw Mrs. Rodriguez, brave and dignified despite everything she'd suffered. She saw Mitchell, who even now refused to look at the people his actions had hurt. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Chen began, "6 months ago, you made a choice to drink and drive. That was your first mistake, but it wasn't your last. When you hit Mrs. Rodriguez, you had another choice. You could have stopped, called for help, and taken responsibility for your actions. Instead, you chose to drive away." Mitchell's lawyers had coached him to look remorseful, but Judge Chen could see through the act. "Your decision to leave the scene didn't just hurt Mrs. Rodriguez," she continued. "It led to the arrest of 2 innocent teenagers who had the courage to do what you should have done. They stopped to help. They called for assistance. They stayed with the victim until help arrived. And for their kindness, they were handcuffed and charged with felonies." Judge Chen picked up the sentencing documents from her desk. "Mr. Mitchell, the prosecution has asked for 8 years in prison. Your defense team has asked for probation. I've listened to arguments about your lack of prior offenses, your contributions to charity, your family responsibilities. All of those things matter in determining an appropriate sentence." The courtroom held its breath. "But I've also considered the courage shown by Arya and Luna Carter, who did everything right and were punished for it. I've considered the dignity of Mrs. Rodriguez, who survived your cowardice and found the strength to forgive you when you haven't even asked for forgiveness. I've considered the damage your actions did not just to one elderly woman, but to 2 families and to public faith in our justice system." Judge Chen looked directly at Mitchell. "Life," she said, and the word hung in the air like a physical presence. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of people breathing seemed loud. "Life," she repeated, "is what Mrs. Rodriguez almost lost because of your selfish choices. Life is what Arya and Luna Carter gave back to her when they stopped to help instead of driving away. Life is what they chose to preserve over their own convenience and safety." Mitchell's face had gone pale, and his lawyers were leaning forward in their seats. Life is precious. Mr. Mitchell, and your actions showed a complete disregard for its value. You nearly took Mrs. Rodriguez's life through negligence, then tried to destroy 2 young lives through cowardice. Judge Chen paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. However, she continued, this court also believes in redemption. Mrs. Rodriguez has shown us what grace looks like. Aria and Luna Carter have shown us what courage looks like. Now it's time for you to show us what accountability looks like. She looked down at her sentencing documents. Thomas Mitchell, this court sentences you to 12 years in state prison for vehicular assault, hit and run and leaving the scene of an accident. You will serve a minimum of 8 years before being eligible for parole. You will also pay full restitution to Mrs. Rodriguez for her medical expenses and ongoing care needs. Mitchell slumped in his chair as his lawyers frantically took notes. Furthermore, Judge Chen continued, upon your release, you will complete 2,000 hours of community service working with organizations that support victims of drunk driving. You will speak at high schools about the consequences of drunk driving, and you will participate in victim impact programs for the remainder of your probation period. The judge set down her papers and looked around the courtroom. One final time. Let me be clear about something, she said. This case was never really about Mr. Mitchell's crimes. It was about how our justice system responds when good people try to do the right thing. Aria and Luna Carter represent the best of what we hope for in our citizens. They saw someone in need and they helped, even though it would have been easier to just drive away. David, Carter felt tears in his eyes as he listened to Judge Chen's words. The fact that these young women were arrested for their good deed should shame all of us, the judge continued. It should remind us that our system is only as good as the people who operate it, and that we must constantly work to ensure that justice is truly blind to everything except the facts and the law. As the hearing ended and people began filing out of the courtroom, Mrs. Rodriguez made her way over to where Aria and Luna were sitting with their father. Thank you, she said simply, hugging each girl in turn. Thank you for stopping that night. Thank you for staying with me. Thank you for caring about a stranger. Mrs. Rodriguez, Aria said, we're sorry it took so long for the real truth to come out. Mija, the elderly woman replied, the truth was always there. It just took time for the right people to listen. David Carter watched his daughters embrace the woman he'd helped save, and he thought about how much had changed since that morning 6 months ago when they'd sat in the federal courthouse watching him argue for civil rights. They'd learned hard lessons about how the system could fail, but they'd also learned that truth and justice could ultimately prevail when good people refused to give up. The federal investigation triggered by their case had led to reforms in police departments across the country. Officer Johnson was serving 2 years in federal prison for civil rights violations. Detective Harrison had been sentenced to 5 years for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. District Attorney Blake would never practice law again. More importantly, their case had sparked a national conversation about racial bias in policing and the importance of believing witnesses and examining evidence before making arrests. As they walked out of the courthouse that day, Luna turned to her father and asked the same question she'd posed 6 months earlier. Dad, what happens to all the kids who don't have someone like Patricia Wong to defend them? This time, David had an answer. We make sure they don't need one, he said. We fix the system so that every kid gets treated fairly from the start, so that evidence matters more than assumptions, and so that doing the right thing doesn't get you arrested. It was an ambitious goal, maybe an impossible one, but as David Carter looked at his daughters, both stronger and wiser for everything they'd been through, he believed it was a goal worth fighting for. After all, that's what justice was supposed to be about, protecting the innocent, holding the guilty accountable, and making sure that courage was rewarded instead of punished. On that sunny afternoon in Washington, D.C., as the Carter family walked away from a courthouse where justice had finally been served, it felt like anything was possible.